Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, Assessing Winterkill and What You Can Do About It through Forage Rejuvenation. I'm Ellen Crane. I'm the Extension Coordinator for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I will be your moderator for tonight. This session will last approximately 1 hour, but may go longer depending on the number of questions you've got for us later on during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, tweet along with us using the hashtag BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I will email out a link to the recording to everyone that registered in a couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything tonight and you want to catch or watch anything again, you can. Of course, you'll be able to hear and see tonight's presenters, but we can't hear or see you. If you want to communicate with us, type into the small chat window in the control panel on the side of your screen. If you have a question or comment for me or either of the presenters, you can ask those at any time, and we'll answer them all at the end of the hour. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it might help to close other programs that are using the internet. So you might want to close the webcam window, which means you won't be able to see us, but you'll be able to hear what's being said. So with that, let's get started. This is what we will be covering tonight. You are going to hear from 3 speakers on the webinar. They'll be talking about assessing winterkill on various topics and what you can do about it, including forage rejuvenation. And then we will open everything up for question and answer period from the audience. So with that, let's get started. Our first speaker for tonight is Bill Thomas of BT Agronomy. Bill was the recipient of the 2017 Canadian Forage and Grassland Association's Leadership Award. During his 30 years of extension service in Nova Scotia, Bill implemented educational forage production programs at Dalhousie University Agriculture Campus. His work as a lecturer at Dalhousie continues in the forage and soil management and livestock production courses. He's developed policies on nutrient management, beef development, and agriculture awareness. He is a member of the Nova Scotia Institute of Agrology, Agrology Institute of Canada, and the Canadian Society of Agronomy, and has served on several forage and crop research committees. Tonight, Bill will be speaking about the reasons for winterkill. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Bill. I'm just going to open your PowerPoint here 1 second. This one. Okay. Can you hear me, Bill?
Yes, I can. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'll be speaking on environmental stresses that cause winter injury and winter kill in forages. The major environmental stresses resulting in winter injury and kill are cold temperatures, fluctuating temperatures, ice sheeting, and excess soil moisture. You know, with the climate change, there is a risk that forage stands being injured or killed by environmental stresses is predicted to increase. For instance, just in this last month, we've had temperatures probably as high as +8 to as low as -18 in this area. And so we're probably being set up for another year of winter kill. Last winter was probably the worst winter kill that we've seen in maybe 20 years. Change slides, please. The single most important factor influencing plant winter hardiness is sub-freezing temperatures. Next slide. When properly hardened off, many of our perennial forage species can tolerate temperatures as low as -10 to -15. Below these temperatures, waters left in the cell freezes, forming ice crystals that puncture the cell membranes, causing cell death and winter kill. Both the length and intensity of cold is important. Alfalfa has been shown to tolerate temperatures of -20 to -26 for a few hours, but they can be damaged at temperatures of -10 when exposed for a few days. Next slide. This slide here is a table comparing grass species for cold hardiness. And you can see the various species: wheat canary grass, orchard grass, meadow fescue, meadow foxtail, Kentucky bluegrass, and timothy. These are the major common forage species in eastern Canada for grasses. You can see the cold hardiness, the LT50. LT is standing for lethal temperature, at which 50% of the population is killed. And you can see that the most winter hardy, the most cold hardy grass is timothy. And then it goes up all the way up to reed canary grass. The interesting thing to note is that reed canary grass seems to be the most vulnerable, that have the least cold hardiness, which is true if for the above ground or soil level plant parts, the crown of the grass, etc. But this is the only grass on that list of grasses that is rhizomatous. So it has underground stems. And so those stems that are growing under the soil surface are protected by the surrounding soils. And so this species actually has a greater cold hardiness than is actually shown there. All the other grasses are bunch type grasses, and that's pretty much the order of them. So here, the next slide, please, is the capacity to tolerate winter conditions. You can see the grasses, timothy and smooth brome grass, are very good. Timothy seldom, if ever, do we see winter kill with timothy. Reed canary grass, you can see is good. It's not fair. Tall fescue, meadow fescue, orchard grass, and the festoliums are all fair or fair to good. Perennial ryegrass is poor. On the legume side, it's birdsfoot trefoil that's good, alfalfa and red clover. And those are really in the order of probably tolerance. Birdsfoot trefoil being more tolerant than alfalfa, which is more tolerant than red clover. White clover has got a poor winter tolerance, and that's mainly because of the fact that it has above ground stems, are called stolons. So the plant actually spreads much like a strawberry plant with these stolons and is quite susceptible to winter kill. Here's a case in point. Next slide, please, is a case in point. Back in 1972 was one of the most severe kills events in PEI history. It was attributed to a prolonged period of sub-freezing temperatures at the soil level. In other words, there was no snow cover. Red clover sustained the greatest losses, followed by alfalfa and then orchard grass. Birdsfoot trefoil and smooth brome grass suffered less damage, while timothy was relatively unaffected. Now, a snow layer, or a layer of snow, can adequately insulate the soil and prevent direct freezing damage. The next slide, please. This next slide here is showing the hourly average canopy temperature in February in Minnesota back in 1994. This is a 3-day period, and you can see here, I'll just get my pointer here. This is temperature on this side. This is 3 days, 3-day event here. This is noon of each day. This solid white line here is no snow cover, the temperature at the canopy with no snow cover or soil level. This here is 10 centimeters. This light dotted line is 10 centimeters of snow. This heavier dotted line is 20 centimeters of snow cover. You can right away see that this first day here, the temperature rose very quickly that morning till early afternoon, and then it just plunged. It plunged down to near minus 14. And then the next day, even during the night, it warmed up till early afternoon, and then it started to fall. Fell through the night. The next day, it warmed up, and then the next night, it plummeted again. So this kind of yo-yo effect can be quite common, particularly with climate change, particularly in places like the Maritimes in southern Quebec. You can see here that this is with 10 centimeters of snow. You can see that line has just smoothed right out relatively to the no snow cover. And of course, 20 centimeters is even more smoothed out. There's less variation. And so here with just 10 centimeters of snow, instead of having a minus 14 temperature, it actually was only about minus 7 or 8. So that's considerably better. So with adequate snow cover, and it's felt that about 10 centimeters of snow is adequate, many stands can withstand anywhere from minus 25 or even minus 30 degrees Celsius as long as there's snow cover. Next slide, please. There is a significant varietal differences with species. It's important to use regionally adapted forage species and varieties with appropriate winter hardiness and disease resistance. Because varieties with superior winter hardiness ratings and a high disease resistance index are much less likely to experience winter injury. In this slide, you can see that these are variety plots of tall fescue. You can see that particular variety had no winter hardiness relative to the other varieties under test. And this is at the Japan Research Station, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is just outside Amherst, which is right at the Nova Scotia New Brunswick border. I just wanted to state that there has been significant success in breeding for winter hardiness in alfalfa by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada over the years. The Maritime region has really benefited from that particular program over the years. Ice sheeting. Here in the Maritimes and again in southern Quebec, there can be precipitation and freeze-thaw cycles that often lead to the formation of an ice layer on the soil surface. This is called ice sheeting, and ice provides little or no protection to low air temperatures. I actually took this picture just at the edge of town here, and you can see how little snow cover. We have now gotten about 10 inches of snow on the ground now since then, but we had these warm temperatures. We lost a lot of our snow, and you can see the ice in that particular field, and that's quite typical. And what happens if you have prolonged ice is that you get a depletion of soil oxygen under the ice. What happens is the soil microbes continue to respire. They use up all the oxygen, and they fill the area under the ice, the atmosphere under the ice, with carbon dioxide, which is toxic to plants like alfalfa. It's also in anaerobic conditions in the soil, and so they're producing ethanol and methanol and lactic acid. And whereas most of our winter hardy grasses can endure long periods of ice encasement, legumes can endure only short periods. For example, ice sheeting lasting longer than 7 days can cause significant injury, even death, to alfalfa plants. And that's really because of the CO2 levels. Here in the next slide, please. Are you seeing a table there with comparison between grass species for ice tolerance? Ellen?
We are now, yep.
Okay. So you can see here that this is a table with species, the various species, again, those same species, but instead of cold tolerance, this is ice tolerance. So this is LI, or lethal ice. And you can see these are the number of days in which 50% of the plants would die if they were covered, for instance, wheat canary with 26 days of ice. Again, this is wheat canary grass is a rhizomatous grass, and so it's got quite good tolerance to ice sheeting. Orchard grass, not very wet, 9 days, close to alfalfa. Meadow fescue's better, meadow foxtail's better. Kentucky bluegrass, which is a common lawn grass, etc., 26 days, and also used, of course, as a common pasture grass. Timothy, 37 days under ice before you lose 50% of the plants. Next slide. Should read frost heaving. Frost heaving occurs when ice layers form in wet soils during freeze-thaw cycles. The ice expands and the soil, and it thrusts the roots and crowns of tap-rooted species out of the ground. And this leaves them exposed to cold air temperatures and desiccating actions of winds. And this can be a real problem, particularly if it was wet in the fall. If it was wet in the fall and the soils are waterlogged, or a lot of the air spaces in the soil are taken up by water. When we get a freeze-thaw cycle, we get this thrusting of the roots and crowns of tap-rooted species out of the soil. It's called frost heaving. And you can see that we don't grow pure stands of alfalfa in the Maritimes here. What we do is we'll put in about 30% of the stand will be a grass in the stand. And one of the reasons for that, there's several reasons, but one of the reasons is the fibrous root system of the grass helps reduce frost heaving. That's what we think. Coming to the end of my talk here, but fluctuating temperatures are a real issue, particularly with climate change. Warm temperatures, anything from 0 to 5 degrees C, depending on the species, can cause the forage plant to deharden or break dormancy. Now, if that is followed by an extreme cold or icy weather, severe winter injury and kill may result. There's species differences. It's been shown that alfalfa loses its cold tolerance faster than timothy, but more slowly than smooth brome grass. Now, not much is really known about, at least that I could find out, about dehardening, the conditions, etc., for each particular species. But it is known from Norway that timothy in particular is responsive to day length, so that during short days, it holds its hardiness better and is less likely to deharden than later in the year when the day lengths are longer. Soil moisture. Wet soils in the fall prevent plants from reaching their full hardening potential, and soils with excessive moisture are poorly aerated, as I spoke earlier, have greater soil freezing, that frost heaving is there, and it promotes ice sheeting. And plus, the plants go into the winter under stress, and whether it's disease, whether it is soil pH or cutting or whatever, if the plants go under stress in the winter, they're far more vulnerable to winter injury and kill. So I talked about environmental reasons for winter kill. Here's some aspects or factors affecting winter survival. Factors affecting winter survival are stand age. Older stands are more vulnerable to winter kill, particularly alfalfa in the second, third, and fourth production years are far more susceptible to winter kill. Soil pH, if the plants are under stress because of acidic soil conditions, they're more vulnerable. Levels of soil K are important, and I think the next speaker is going to be talking about that. It's also important to have a balance of fertility in the soil to remove stress of the plants. Harvesting frequency and the timing of harvest are important. More frequent harvesting puts the plants under stress, and they are more vulnerable to winter kill, particularly older stands. So older stands that are cut maybe 3 or 4 times can be, particularly alfalfa that's cut 3 or 4 times. That's older. An older stand is much more vulnerable to winter kill than cutting twice, for instance. And timing is important as well, particularly between the second and third cut. There needs to be about 500 growing degree days between those 2 cuts to get good winter hardiness. We often talk about an important fall rest period during September and October. And also the presence of adequate crop stubble in order to trap snow. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll put it back to you, Ellen.
Excellent.
Last
Thank
slide.
you, Bill.
Okay.
Okay. Our next speaker is Christine O'Reilly. Christine is the forage and grazing specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. All right, do a quick share here. Oh no, she's sharing her screen. Sorry, Christine, I kicked you off. You can share yours again. Great areas of focus include the benefits of forages and grazing within cropping systems, forage production and grazing systems for Northern Ontario, which is equivalent to Southern everywhere else in Canada, and improving the productivity and profitability of forages. Christine joined the ministry in 2017 and is based out of the Lindsay office. Tonight, Christine will be speaking about alfalfa winter kill, the prevention and assessment of winter kill in alfalfa. So I'll turn that over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, so I guess I'll just launch right into this. Bill really set us up nicely with a lot of the factors that cause winter kill. So I'd like to take it that next step further and actually start with the assessment piece. So talk a little bit about what you're looking for if you suspect that you might have a winter kill problem, and then talk a bit about what we can do to reduce those risk factors. So this is a picture that one of my colleagues took at the end of April in 2019. We had a really bad year for winter kill in Ontario, particularly with alfalfa. And it seemed like the further east you went in the southern parts of Ontario, the worse it got. I realized that Northern Ontario is southern everywhere else in Canada, but yeah, for Southern Ontario, we had a really bad year for winterkill. So this is an example of a stand that was hit very badly, and as you can see, there's hardly anything left. So in the spring, once the snow has melted and things are starting to green up, the first look that we take at an alfalfa field or an alfalfa grass mixture is to do a plant count. So I like to think of the plant count as your early warning system when you're growing a hay crop. Basically because you are going out there just as things are greening up and those little green shoots are starting to come up and seeing how many healthy plants you have in your field, what actually overwintered. So because alfalfa plants get bigger as they age, the stand will thin out. So the number of healthy plants that you need depends on how old that stand is. So an older stand, you don't need as many plants to have the same yield potential as a younger stand. So if you look at this table on my slide, ideally with a new seeding, you want 20 or more healthy plants per square foot. In the first and second production year, we've got a range on the slide. If you're growing an alfalfa grass mixture, you can usually go to the lower end of that range because the grasses will make up some of the yield. If it was a straight alfalfa stand or for some reason the grass didn't catch, there's not much grass in there, you'd want to be looking at numbers near the higher end of that range, just to make sure that you can hopefully meet your yield potential. And then, 5 healthy plants per square foot if that is in a third production year or older. So while you're out there counting plants, it's a great time to also take a look at how healthy the root systems on those alfalfa plants are. So you can see this is ideally the stage that we want to be doing those plant counts and that root assessment. There's just a little bit of green growth at the top. Things are starting to break dormancy, but we don't have a whole lot of growth out there yet. Ideally, take a jackknife with you. So dig up, and a spade, dig up some roots, and then you want to cut open that big tap root and take a look at the color on the inside. So a healthy root should be like the creamy off-white color of most potatoes. Basically that taproot is storing a lot of starch, just like a potato does, and that's kind of the color and texture that we're looking for. If the root is yellow or brown, that's rot in the root. Usually if it's brown, it's dead, like picture number 5 in the bottom corner there. If it's yellow, that's an unhealthy root. The other thing that happens when alfalfa roots are diseased is that the texture changes. So if it's ropey or stringy inside, that's not a healthy root either. And any plant that you dig up that has unhealthy roots should not be included in your plant count. So if you go to a few spots in your field and you dig up some plants and you're noticing that maybe half the plants you dig up, even though they look fine above the ground, they have sick roots below the ground, then maybe take your average plant count and divide that number by 2 as an example, just so that you're not including those unhealthy roots in your healthy plant count because they may not make it. Okay, so that was our early warning system. I suppose I should back up one thing. The reason I call it your early warning system is because we do that right at green up. You've got a chance, if you notice a problem, to get on the phone with your seed dealer and figure out how you're going to deal with it. Depending on the severity, you may decide to patch that field, so put a grass or put some red clover in it just to kind of get it through this year. If it's very severe, you might decide to terminate that stand and rotate it into something else and plant alfalfa in a different field somewhere else. So that's why those plant counts and the root health assessment is your early warning system. It'll help you flag a big problem early on so that you can have your seed in place and your equipment ready to go as soon as conditions are fit to plant. So a little bit later in the spring, when we've got about 6 inches or 15 centimeters of growth, you want to go back out to your alfalfa field and do a stem count. So each alfalfa plant has a crown, and that crown puts out multiple stems. And what research has found out of Wisconsin is that yield is more closely correlated to the number of stems per square foot than the number of crowns. So while we have our early warning system, we've averted a total disaster by being proactive. Now we want to see actually how likely are we to get full yield from this crop. So if you have 55 or more stems per square foot, that is 100% yield potential. So that crop should be able to give you everything it's genetically capable of, you know, before weather and insects and disease and things get hold of it. So 55 stems per square foot or more, that's ideal. If your stem count is somewhere in the range of 40 to 50%, you're looking at between 75 to 92% yield potential. So that's something to consider in your longer term crop plan is, okay, the stand is starting to decline. It's fine for this year, but it's something to watch either in the fall or next spring to see, you know, whether you're still going to keep that stand. Generally, by the time we get down to less than 40 stems per square foot, the general advice is that it's not worth keeping. And the main reason for that is you've lost at least 25% of your yield right out of the gate, but also because of the economics behind it. So essentially when we're making hay, harvest is a fixed cost. There's very little change in the amount of fuel that you use and the amount of wear on equipment, whether you're harvesting a very light crop or a very heavy crop. So harvest is essentially a fixed cost. So if you have a very low yielding hay field, your cost per ton is much higher than if you have a high yielding hay field. So because harvest is the most expensive part of growing a hay crop, generally if an alfalfa stand has less than 40 stems per square foot, we say it's not worth holding on to. So that's a field that if you have to keep it this year to just make up that feed, then definitely it needs to be patched. It might need to be terminated right away and reseeded into something quickly. But either way, if this is your field, your alfalfa field in 2020, you should not have that field still in alfalfa by 2021. So we know from Bill's talk that Winterkill is basically a factor of weather. It's temperature, it's snow cover, and those are things that we can't control. So I do like to focus on things that we can. And Bill did mention this, but reducing stress on the plant really can help our forage crops over winter much, much better. So the first thing that you can do to help reduce risk is selecting a disease-resistant variety. So with alfalfa, varieties are assessed on how resistant or susceptible they are to a bunch of different diseases that can seriously impact production. So some disease-resistant indexes will be made up of 6 major alfalfa diseases. So bacterial wilt, verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, anthracnose, Phytophthora root rot, and Aphanomyces root rot race 1. So each variety is given a score out of 5 for each of those diseases. If they just do those 6 diseases in their index that's in the green box, you're going to get a disease-resistant index score out of 30. So 7 out of 30 means the variety is susceptible to all 6 of those diseases. 30 out of 30 means it's highly resistant to all 6 of those diseases. It's not mandatory, but Aphanomyces root rot race 2 is very aggressive, possibly even more aggressive than race 1. So many seed suppliers will include it in their disease-resistant index. So perfect score on that index is out of 35 instead of 30. If you know you've got a particular disease problem in your field, definitely ask your seed supplier what varieties they carry are resistant or highly resistant to that specific disease challenge. But in general, making sure that you have something that is moderately resistant across the board really helps take some stress off of that crop. The other thing about diseases is that the symptoms of all these different diseases often look really similar. So things to watch for is wilting, yellowing or reddish leaves, and that miscoloration in the root. So browning or yellowing and getting stringy. Those are signs that it could be a disease challenge. One other thing to think about with the variety selection piece is fall dormancy ratings. So in Ontario, generally a fall dormancy rating 4 is appropriate. The rating basically is an indication of how early in the spring it starts to grow and how late in the fall it continues to grow. So a higher number tends to give higher yield, but anything above a 5 has really poor winter survival. So in Ontario, we generally say a 4 is appropriate unless we've got consistent problems with winterkill. So for example, the Ottawa Valley has a special talent for killing alfalfa. So in that region, they might want to go with a fall dormancy 3. The other thing about selecting a variety is that plant breeders have managed to disconnect the fall dormancy rating and actual cold tolerance, true winter hardiness, a little bit in cultivars that have a fall dormancy rating between 1 and 4. So some of those cultivars will also have a winter hardiness score. For Ontario, we say a 2 is generally appropriate, but if you're looking at that scale, it's a 1 to 6 scale. 1 is the most winter hardy and 6 is the least. So things to talk to your seed rep about if you are looking for a new variety. And this is an ad that I found in my filing cabinet from 1979. Basically, they were trying to sell a Phytophthora resistant cultivar, but the point I think is very valid. Oftentimes the symptoms of disease look like drought or look like winterkill, when reality is that plant was already really stressed because it was sick. So buying something that has moderate resistance can really help take the pressure off. The next risk factor that is within your control is fertility. So ideally, you'll have a current soil test that is 3 years old or less. And we know with alfalfa specifically that there's an economic response to fertilizer if your soil test is below 12 parts per million of phosphorus or below 120 parts per million of potassium. So that economic response translates usually into yield, occasionally into quality, but in those situations, the fertilizer will pay for itself. Potassium especially is important for winter hardiness. The bottom 2 pictures on these slides show some pretty severe nutrient deficiencies. It's unlikely you'll see these in your field, but just to give you a sense of it, the bigger, slightly greener leaf on the right is a healthy alfalfa leaf, and that stunted bluer one on the left is a phosphorus deficiency. In the photo on the right, those little yellow or white dots around the leaf edge, that's a severe potash deficiency in alfalfa. So alfalfa really is a hungry crop. It has a higher nutrient demand than just about any of the annual crops that we grow in Canada, at least our field crops, maybe not so much on the horticulture side. But if we take a look at the agronomic demands of 3 cuts of alfalfa, giving us a 3.1 tons per acre yield in the course of the year. We're assuming that it's nodulated properly, it's fixing its own nitrogen, so we don't need to give it any of that. But it needs 161 pounds an acre of phosphate and 429 pounds an acre of potash. That's enormous. Like, that's no other field crop compares to that on the potash side. It also has high sulfur demands. I know this is something that those of you in Western Canada probably are used to thinking about. But in Ontario, most of our agricultural land is east of industrial areas. So now that we're cleaning up our air pollution, we're starting to see sulfur deficiencies more and more often. So this is a nutrient we're still getting to grips with. But alfalfa removal is over 5 pounds of sulfur per ton of hay, which is more than canola. So it's also very hungry on the sulfur end. This is a photo of some trial plots out of Purdue University. They were looking at not only adequate fertility, but also balanced fertility. So the plots that stand out really are plot A in the bottom left corner and plot C in the bottom right. And those 2 treatments were given phosphate, but not potash. Everything else was given both nutrients. And what the researchers found was that stand life was significantly shorter on the plots that did not get any potash, and even shorter than the control. So they did have a check that's not in this photo that didn't receive any fertility, and the check persisted longer than the 2 treatments that had phosphate and no potash. There were also some cuts in some years where the check yielded higher than the plots that had no potash. So it really is an important nutrient for alfalfa production. And we can't always assume that our manure is giving the crop a balanced nutrient profile. There's definitely valuable nutrients in manure, and it should be part of our fertility programs, but what comes out of the back end of the animal doesn't always line up with what the crop needs. So making sure that we've got that soil test so we can top up anywhere is helpful in making sure that those stands persist. Bill mentioned this a little bit in his talk, but the next factor that is within our control is respecting that fall rest period. So because the crop needs time to recover and harden off between harvest and a killing frost, by not taking a cut during that window, we can allow the crop to recover and put energy in its root, taproot, so it can regrow quickly in the spring. So this map is showing the average start date of that fall rest period in Ontario. I know a similar map exists for the Maritimes, and I'd encourage you to reach out to your provincial extension folks to get the maps for where you live, because they are something that is helpful in providing some guidance there. So just a quick refresher. I realize this is a picture of grasses, but I can explain it for alfalfa as well. So that energy is stored down in the root system, like in the first photo, and that's like having a full gas tank. So even though the leaves are gone, there's no photosynthesis happening, there's no sugar being produced, there's a full gas tank of energy, a full gas tank of energy waiting in those roots. As the plant starts to regrow, it takes that energy out of the roots and puts it up into the stem to grow new stems and leaves, and that root dies back. Once we get some top growth, it looks like there's forage out there, it looks like there's material to graze or cut, but the reality is that plant is very, very weak. The gas gauge is looking at empty because it's already drawn all the energy reserves out of the root system. So it takes a little longer than we often think for full recovery and to get some energy back in the root reserves to refuel next time. So this is the process in the fall to fuel spring growth. This is the process that happens after every cut or every grazing. The main difference between alfalfa and grasses is alfalfa's got a big taproot to store energy, and grasses tend to store some in the lower part of their stems. So my take-home messages for you tonight are, please scout your fields early and scout them often, because staying on top of pressures during the growing season, insects and diseases, really can make a difference if you get on top of them early. And reducing stress on the crop. So choosing disease-resistant cultivars, fertilizing to recommendations, respecting that fall rest period all make a difference in the level of stress on that plant. And the less stress that the plant has, the more winter hardy it's going to be. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. And I'd just like to remind everybody in the audience, if you have any questions, you can enter those into the question and answer box. It might be down below or might be up above. You can enter those in there. We can answer those at the end of the presentation. Our next speaker will be Graeme Finn, and I'm just looking for Graeme's presentation. Hold on a sec. Oh, I see Bill. There it is. Too many tabs open. Graeme, you still there?
Yep.
There we go. Alrighty, so I'll read your bio here 1 second. So Graeme Finn is an Alberta beef producer at Southern Cross Livestock. Graeme and his wife Heather and their 2 young daughters, Claire and Morgan, operate their beef operation near Madden, Alberta. They manage a cow-calf operation with a focus on year-round grazing, both high legume pastures and annual cover crop grazing. They have been successful in incorporating intensive rotational grazing and winter grazing strategies into their management system. Graeme is a mentor in the Cattlemen's Young Leaders Program and a mentor of the BCRC Mentorship Program. And tonight, Graeme will be speaking about overgrazing winterkill and about forage rejuvenation. So I'll hand that over to you, Graeme.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks very much for having me. And I feel like that I can just sit back. The other guys have really run a great program here, and capped off. I'll just cap off what they're talking, but on more of a grazing side of the situation. So I'm lucky enough to travel right across the prairies and see a lot of grazing situations, both good and bad. And so one of the biggest problems here in Western Canada, people seem to think that if something's left over, well, it's a waste. So the biggest killer of the biggest winter killer here in Western Canada is overgrazing. So this is a picture of a paddock of ours in the background, and a neighbour in the foreground. But we see this right across the prairies. They think that that because there's some foliage left over, that they've wasted feed, and the dollars that they've wasted by pounds on the cattle. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, the next one. Do I click it or you? Oh, there you go. No. Yep. So as I said, what I see around the countryside is overgrazing. It doesn't matter if it's winter or summer. They're not preparing themselves going into winter by leaving foliage up top. The winter and summer grazing can be just as overgrazing can be just as detrimental as what overgrazing with no rest periods. We really believe in rest periods on our place. So you can see in that early winter program there that guy had some pasture, but now he's overgrazed, and as Bill was saying there earlier, has left that root system to be exposed. So he's doing just as much damage in the middle of winter when the plants are dormant by extreme cold and no cover on the soil. And then down in that bottom right-hand picture is a client of ours who used to overgraze. So those paddocks go into summer like that, go into fall like that, and then go into winter like that. So he is really taxing. He's not getting the grazing days out of it. The carrying capacity is going downhill all the time. So we've had to evaluate how his management is, and by having less cattle and adding more rotational grazing. So we can add moisture holding capacity with more foliage up top. We can add shelter for the root systems with more foliage up top, and those solar panels that are above the soil can take energy down into the root systems to prepare them for winter. Next, please. So I like to leave this kind of foliage after cattle leave. These yearlings are just getting ready to move. It was up to their belly, so it depends where you are in Western Canada to what species you're using is what height. So generally, take half, leave half is the norm over here, because if we go into an early season, winter season, we've got great protection here. But if we leave foliage above the soil like this, we can have quicker regrowth if we get longer seasons. So I've found that I've been able to get on my pastures after these cattle have come off in another day or two. In about another 40 to 45 days, we're back grazing again onto the same rotation. So I haven't wasted forage, I've speeded up growth, and which is a big plus for what we're trying to do with our grass yearlings and our beef cows. And then we can go back later in the season. We can use stockpile forage as long as we don't overgraze it. But normally, what we do with the yearlings, they're normally off by around 25th of September to early October. And then after we wean, we'll throw dry cows on something like this, and then they just clean up a little bit without taking it too far to the ground. Next, please. So this is a picture of a friend of mine down towards Medicine Hat. He's just bought the paddock on the left there, and then he's owned this paddock on the right for a number of years now. His management style was completely different from the fellow on the left. They did have a fence line up the middle, and now he's starting to rotational graze. He's pulled all the fence lines out of both places. But you can see there on the right-hand side, his grazing management style with the rotations he did do with portable electric fencing has really helped to boost the soil health and the plant health and the root systems. And then the fellow on the left, he went and stock rate all summer, didn't do any rotations. Plants started playing out, the legumes have left town, and the weeds and dandelions have started taking over. One thing about this picture is the fellow on the left only seeded about 10 pounds an acre of a blend, and then the producer on the right hand side went a full 15 pounds an acre and added legumes into the grass stand as well. So when you are going to seed a pasture, just because we can't control the weather, it's better to put more seed in than less. The more room we leave for weeds to take advantage of, as you can see, they really will. So what we try to do is overcompensate, and that'll either take natural death takes it out or winter kill, but we've still got enough there to control the weed situation and maintain a healthy pasture and production pasture. So the long-term management really affects the way your grasses grow. You can get long-term management in proper grazing management and make it a 10 to 15 year stand, or you can overgraze and tax it really early and then go and spend another $60 to $70 reseeding again later in 4 or 5 years time. So the yep, we can flip to the next one, please. So this is the kind of pastures that I have on the right hand side here. I usually kind of work with the dogs most of the time, but this is how much forage I do leave. We like I said earlier, that forage will be back over those dogs in about 40 to 45 days. And then this is a new client, person, a friend of ours that it's, this paddock is actually only 3.5 years old. When this photograph was taken, it even looks worse now. He taxed it the very first year. He didn't let the root systems get developed. So he was putting pressure on the plants before we even started. And my general rule is to not touch the crop the year of seeding at all. I want the root systems to be developed. I want to get plenty of solar panel above the soil to help get that young seedling ready for winter, and also to cap snow to give it a good kick in the spring, so it's well ahead of any other competition it's got. But you can see the difference between well managed and it's not a waste. This is one thing we've got to get across to people, that leaving forage is not a waste. It's an asset to the whole farm, your whole grazing operation, and to the soil, where it's sequestering carbon. The fellow on the left is not. Fellow myself on the right is, which is bringing fertility back into the soil from the environment. Okay, next please. So I'm pretty much rounding up what Bill and Christine were talking about earlier. The number one asset on our place is not the machinery, it's not the cattle, it's my soil and my pastures. So I try to look after them as best as we can. So I'm going to do a real quick talk here on reseeding into old pastures, which we do quite a lot of here. And we do have a custom seeding business, but this pasture here, I have round that up in the fall. So what I did round that up in the fall. There wasn't much value in the forages that were there, but as you can see, I've left that stand of existing previous grass there for acting like a nurse crop, but not taking nutrients away from the plants when we're seeding in the spring. So, but it's giving it shade, it's capturing moisture through the winter before I start seeding. So it's setting the soil up for a really good seed bed for those plants to go into. as Christine says, one of the biggest things that guys seem to forget is fertility. These young seedlings are going to an environment which is pretty harsh in most places, and we expect them to get up and go and produce for us for 10, 15 years. But if we don't treat them right in the first year, then we let them down, and then they let us down the long run, which will cost us money in the long term. So I always get fertility tests and have a starter fertilizer with it. And then if it has to be topped up, I did that in 2018 through the drought. We had some rain, I threw some fertilizer out, and it recovered the pasture quite well. So we're building the strength of the plant. And I was worried about going into winter from a drought into winter and in Winterkill, but it really helped a little bit of fertilizer. When you think about, $45 worth of fert onto your soil, in the long term, it really pays off, especially when you're in a stressed out situation with plants. So if you are going to seed in the frost, some situations will need a spray out. Other situations, I find that the plants are so sparse that there's plenty of room for seedlings to go in there. So you really have to assess the situation on your own farm to which you need to do. But if you're going to seed in the frost, first I get the soil sample, and then I'm doing a temperature tests. And normally around here, and I'm in the foothills, so it's a little different from out east of here, but I'm waiting for the soil to be below 5 in the morning and below 5 at night. I want a constant below 5 so we don't get germination. If you go out in the morning, it's below 5, and you go out in the afternoon and do the same test again, and you're 8 or 9 above, well, you better wait, because the plants will germinate. So the normal time for that around here is probably the first 2 weeks in November. We've found, and we've done a lot of frost seeding into there, and it's been pretty successful. So, it's trial and error. What I always say, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So find someone in your area that's done a bit of frost seeding, and then get their advice, and save yourself some money by going on their mistakes. So the next one, please. So after establishment, this is the same paddock of the previous picture. After establishment, I leave it to rest for a whole year. We don't put any pressure on it. We let it do its thing. We let the roots expand. We let the foliage up top. All that solar panel is bringing atmospheric energy into the root system. And if we go and tax it too early, well, then that's when we see most of the winter kill. We use sandfoin, vetch, and alfalfa over here. We kind of use birdsfoot trefoil and clovers mainly through the parklands, and wetter areas where the most common area for sandfoin, vetch, alfalfas is out of the parklands towards Saskatchewan, and into Manitoba, but kind of below Saskatoon and Edmonton and those kind of places. But they're the main varieties we use for ourselves too, and we run about a 70% legume pasture, 60 to 70. For ours, we want milk production for the cows, and we want pounds for the yearlings. So after we have a pasture like this established, then if I need to, I can throw some dry cows in there and do a light grazing in the fall. But usually just leave it like this, captures a lot of moisture. And then I can run cattle in there early next year. They'll have some roughage from the old growth. We find that we can move there through really quick when we're bringing in yearlings, and then some stockpile forage we can use later on. We use a lot of electric fencing, and I think electric fencing is one of the biggest assets for any ranch for overgrazing. It's so portable and so quick. It doesn't have to be 5 wires. It can be one single wire as long as you've got a good energizer. And if you decide no, you want a bigger paddocks, it's easy to pull out with the equipment that's around today by the different companies, and then reset somewhere else on the program. But I find people are really surprised how much more they can get out of their pastures with using rotational management programs. And it's the cheapest thing you can do on your farm is put electric fencing in. It's cheaper than actually what your pasture is. Next, please. So I've got some take-home messages as well. If you know, simple bullet points here. Don't overgraze in the growing season. It's not a waste. It's some assets you're going to use later on in the season with either late stockpile forage or winter moisture capturing with the snow ready for the spring. Utilize rotational grazing. We always have the system here that we don't use one paddock a year. It'll be rested, it'll set seed, but we use it the first in May when we go to grass and calving grass. So, but in the system here, there's always one paddock that doesn't get grazed in that particular year, just to rest the paddock. Leaving plenty of foliage in the pasture, take half, leave half. We talked about that, and that's pretty easy to do. It doesn't matter if you've got short grass prairies in the Hat or Shaunavon or in Manitoba somewhere. You know how tall your grasses grow. So if you can take half, leave half, you'll set yourself up for success for winter survivability. Make sure you select the right species, and Bill talked about that very first off. So we try to select drought tolerant, winter hardiness, quick growing, and it's hard to get all these in one plant. So that's why we have diversity. And we don't tend to use Timothy much over here. We don't seem to get the value out of it for the cattle. So it's your bromes, softleaf tall fescues, orchard grasses in the foothills, pubescent wheatgrasses and all that out on the prairies. So as I said before, sandfoin, we use Glenview sandfoin, size of milk vetch, and we kind of look for grazing alfalfas here. We're not really into cutting alfalfas. We find they don't last as long. So we're looking for Siberian alfalfas for grazing production. Algonquin is another one I like to use. And then weeds. Where we overgraze, we have weeds, and they're the biggest advantage takers there is. They're lazy. They like big open spaces. They don't like crowding. They don't get grazed because they're not palatable. So when we talked about earlier, if you're seeding new pastures, don't skimp on the seed. You know, it might be $70 worth of seed instead of $50 worth of seed, but in 10 years' time, you'll be thanking yourself you did it. And if you leave it too sparse, well, you'll end up with the weeds of, you know, taking over the space where you haven't got plants. And fertilize. We always fertilize either with cattle in our rotations with stock density, and or with NPKs onto pasture stands that we're getting a little, like I said, drought stricken. But we always go with those with a with a soil test, so we're not just willy-nilly throwing it out there. So, and with that, I think that's it. Yep, that's me done.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. Okay, so now we will take any of your questions. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, you can enter those into the Q&A box, and we will get to those. So we had some come in already. I think this one might be for Bill. What about milk vetch? Can it stand colder weather? Or if anyone else is familiar with milk vetch?
Bill's line's still on mute, eh, Ellen?
I can probably answer that one if you like. Milk vetch is one of my favorite plants. The beauty of milk vetch, it can handle wet conditions and it can handle drier conditions. It's a tap-rooted plant, but it reseeds. So cattle can be grazing that, and it'll pass through the rumen. And we've got lots of bush paddocks where we can't seed, and we've got sizer and sandfoin coming through it, and it's relatively cheap. So once you get it established, make sure you buy seed that's scarified and it'll germinate quicker. If you don't, it'll take a little longer to germinate. But it is one of those plants that once you've got it, it's in the pastures forever. It's related to the pea family, so it climbs, or it'll creep across the soil, and it captures a lot of snow. And this time of year, we've got cows out on stockpiled size of milk fetch, and they're doing very, very well on it. And so yeah, it's a real win-win for me.
Okay, Bill, can we hear you there?
I think so. In the East, at least in the Maritimes, it's considered, I'm sorry, Graeme, a little bit of a weed.
Yeah.
Okay, to avoid winter kill, how long do you leave an alfalfa stand in fall prior to the winter?
So I think the super sciencey answer is somewhere in the ballpark of 460 to 480 growing degree days. That's a little bit of calculation involved. I know in Ontario that works out to be about 6 weeks before the first killing frost. So that's how the Ontario maps were generated for that fall rest period. You would have to know your daily maximum and minimum temperatures and then subtract 5 degrees and add them all up to figure out how many growing degree days you're accumulating each day in the fall. So you could do it relatively precisely for your area, but probably your provincial extension people will have a similar map to the one I showed that will be based on historical data of roughly how quickly your area accumulates growing degree days in the fall, and then back calculating for a date of roughly 460, 480 degree days before that first killing frost hits.
There was also some work done by Gilles Belanger. There was a 6-site study done, and some of those sites were in Atlantic Canada, in which they looked at the time between the second and third cut of a 3-cut harvest alfalfa system. And they found that if they had about 500 growing degree days between the second cut and the third cut, they seemed to get their best winter hardiness out of the alfalfa, which is kind of interesting. So that was in some trial work, but Christine is right. You know, that's what we use here, a good fall rest period. And we say, you know, you really shouldn't cut your alfalfa, you know, after about September 5th or so, you know, and then until we get, you know, what we would call a good stiff frost, which is probably here about October 25th or so. And then we say that you can take it after that if you need the feed, but cut it high. That's kind of problematic though, in the sense that, you know, all that, you don't have much stubble there to catch snow, et cetera, and there's not much insulation value. So that is a bit risky, but less of a risk than cutting it during that September, October period.
I guess the other thing too is the highest risk time is the middle of that fall rest period. So if you really need the feed and you got to cut, if you can cut at the very beginning or the very end, that's lower risk. It's not no risk, but it's lower risk. Because if you need the feed, you need the feed. But if you're cutting during the fall rest period, I suggest planning to terminate that stand or patch that stand, something. That stand is probably going to hurt. And you know what, if you get lucky, then that's a nice surprise. But if you have to cut during the fall rest period, be prepared to renovate that field, yeah.
And a lot of people don't like leaving, like as Graeme was saying, leaving all that feed out there. But it really influences the first cut, in fact, the harvest of the next year. If you take it that fall, you know, you won't have it the next spring. So you're robbing yourself, really. And a lot of times a farmer might not need that feed, but they just don't like to see it being left out there. And that's a mistake, because it really is an investment for next year and for the longevity of that stand, its productivity.
Okay. Any varieties of sainfoin that have proven to do well in southwestern Ontario?
Not that I'm aware of. To my knowledge, and I'm willing for someone to tell me I'm wrong on this, but to my knowledge, we have winter hardy-ish varieties that are adapted to Western Canada, and there are moisture tolerant varieties that are adapted to England, Ireland, those kinds of places. But I don't think a plant breeder has managed to get both of those traits into a cultivar. So Sainfoin tends to die on us in Ontario. Sorry.
It's the opposite for us out here. It's the management and like rest periods, and it can get like sizer and take over as well. So it's a pink revolution over here.
What is the best way to reseed a pasture that has poor performance in central Alberta? What equipment would you use? And you could answer that not just for central Alberta, but.
Yeah, I'm a bit biased, but I bought my machine out of Australia. So we've proven that over there versus hoe point and disc opener drills. But as long as you've got into sod, you need ground penetration. I've seen a lot of drills that are built too light and they skid across the top. And so you want to make sure your conditions are right. If you do have it, the most common type is a disc type opener up here. But if it's skidding across the top, just stop, wait for some rain, get it in there. Just, you know, a couple of days after rain. You don't want to do it while it's really moist because you smear the edge of the fallow. And so that produces a hard face on there, and also the trash that's in there, it will start rotting, which will take the seed out as well. But you know, it's what you can do, whatever you can get from your county or a contractor, and you make the best of it. But don't rush. If you've got the drill today and it's not quite right, don't go and do it. Just wait till you can get those discs or openers into the soil, and then proceed there, because you're going to end up wasting money and you're paying for the drill or the contractor to do it and the seed cost. But you know, there's some good drills out there, but there's not a lot of good drills out there. So yeah.
The only thing that I would add to that is that, you know, why do you need to renovate the pasture? Is there something else that's going on? Is it being overgrazed? Is there insufficient phosphorus? You know, what's going on in that pasture that maybe is a concern, and that maybe fencing would fix? Because many times people get themselves back into a similar situation, because really the issue is maybe more of a grazing management issue or a fertility issue, et cetera. So maybe what's needed is fencing. I don't know, but I just throw that out there.
That's pretty much right, Bill. Like, you know, it doesn't take much to get cattle to move around, because they will concentrate and graze out stuff.
I guess the only thing I'll add, and just because Bill and I are in a different climate than Graeme, is often to overseed in a wetter climate, you need to knock back the established stand to really get a good catch, because the water will be there at the right time of year, whether it's spring, or sometimes we can have some success with fall seedings. But if you don't mow or graze, or, I mean, Graeme mentions spraying it off, just something to really knock that established stand back, your seedlings are going to have a hard time competing for light and water. So I can't speak for a prairie kind of environment, but for Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, knocking back that established stand to give the new seedlings a chance to germinate and grow is going to help have a successful catch.
Yeah, I always call it the eighth wonder of the world. You know, our forages start to grow here, sort of, I don't know, let's say the third week in April, you know, they start to green up. And we're taking a cutoff, you know, by the end of May. So we're looking at like 5 or 6 weeks. We've got forage that is knee high, you know, and I think it's more impressive than the pyramids, to be honest with you. It's very impressive to see forage grow like that in the spring. And so if you seed into that in the spring, it's really tough for a little seedling to make it, you know. So you have to do something, either seed later, you know, a little bit later if you're going to seed early, then maybe graze hard the fall previously, or graze that spring or something, take a cut or something.
Graeme, you had mentioned a couple of times about giving that rest period to forage that's been newly planted. Does that seem to pay for itself in the long run, giving that first year off?
Yep. Yeah, it does for me. Yeah, definitely. I've seen a lot of guys think if it's green, graze it. And so that's one of the things we've seen here. Our foragers they just don't understand that panel above the soil does not represent the root system underneath the soil. So they're taxing that plant right away, and it's trying to grow. It's building root systems by taking energy out of the atmosphere and putting it into roots. It's mining fertility underneath the soil as well. So yeah, it's like you got to look at it as I can have a short time, benefit and get really, hammered early or in the first 2 or 3 years, especially the first year, and graze it because it's green, and then later on it'll kick you in the butt as far as longevity of a stand goes. So we've some guys, I'll literally take a padlock and lock that gate and to keep them out of it, and I've done that twice, and they just don't understand. It's a baby and it's growing, and so we've got to look after and nurture it in this first year to have success in a long-term project. But yeah, that's my philosophy: is you look at after in the first year and look after you for 7 or 8 years, 10 years down the track.
And Graeme, I think you're dealing a lot with what I would call jointed species. In other words, these are tall growing species that tend to head out, etc. In the East, we deal for pastures with a lot of non-jointed grasses. And so the grazing heights of those grasses is not as tall as yours in order to keep them productive. So we would graze them probably from a height of 10 inches or so down to about 4 or 5 inches. Again, your suggestion of taking half, leaving half, or, is a great suggestion. But it's just a different grazing height here because we're dealing with different species.
Right.
Okay, I think I'll end things there for questions. There were some great questions tonight.
I think I've just one last comment, Ellen.
Sure.
Graeme, I think I like to say it's the same thing that you're saying, but I like to say if you take care of your plants, they'll take care of your animals.
Yep.
Grass doesn't just happen.
Perfect. So just a couple more things before you go. One is how you can get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to beefresearch.ca and click on the subscribe button to join our email list and also to sign up for our e-newsletter, The Wire. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Our next webinar is Prevent External Parasites from Bugging Your Cattle. That'll be on Thursday, March 12th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. The speakers will be Catherine Rochon and Dr. Sean Dursoff from AAFC. You'll receive an email from me in a couple of days with a link to watch this webinar recording, as well as links to some additional information on assessing Winterkill. You'll receive a link to a survey, and if you can take a few minutes of your time to fill out the survey, it's very helpful for us when making new webinars. And that's it. So thank you at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everyone at the BCRC, thank you, Christine, Bill, and Graeme, for volunteering your time and expertise with us tonight.
Thank
You're
you. Have a good night.
Yeah. Good night.
Thank you, and good night.